Hello Year 12. Welcome back to another video on the Supreme Court and the key civil rights issues that go along with that. This is the third lesson for civil rights. By the time I've uploaded this video, there should be a fourth lesson, which will be the final lesson on civil rights. So we should be getting close to finishing off the Supreme Court in total. Having said that, there is going to be a while before I set anything new on the VLE, apart from recap tasks and quizzes and things like that, because we need to make sure, due to the current issues that are going on around schooling, we need to make sure that everyone is up to date, has access to everything, and is ready to move on. And so moving on from this topic into another topic, if everybody hasn't actually got to the point where they're finished, it would be bad for the people that are behind, and it would mean that we'd have lots of people at different points. So there's going to be a while before we set anything new on the VLE. So if you are sat there and you've got nothing to do in your government and politics time after this, and you've done my work and Mr. Oswald's work's finished as well, then I would suggest revise. Revise the stuff that we've done. Make sure everything is fresh in your head. Go back to the original British politics stuff. Make sure you know all that stuff, because that stuff is just as important and you will need to know it for your exam. Anyway, let's talk about the key civil rights issues that still are in America right now, and let's talk about some of the things that have been put into place to fix those. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is voting rights. So voting rights for African Americans would not have been possible without Congress passing civil rights laws such as the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This was only supposed to be like a 5-year stopgap piece of legislation that would then move into something bigger. However, it's been renewed over and over again, and nothing new has been put in. So in 2006, President Bush supported Congress in reauthorizing the voting rights key provisions for another 25 years, and it's something that keeps happening over and over again. Now, this caused a bit of controversy because in that, Article 5 includes what we call a pre-clearance. Okay, I'm going to talk about what pre-clearance is in a second. And this was in there to ensure that there was no room to remove a bad result due to racial differences in a state. Okay, and I'm not very good at explaining this. I've tried to explain it about 3 times and not managed it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to point you towards this website, which is justice.gov/crt/about Section 5 Voting Rights Act. And here is the key paragraph you want to look at. Okay, so it's what? 1, 2, 3, 4, fourth paragraph down. Under Section 5, so I'm reading this one. Under Section 5, any change with respect to voting in a covered jurisdiction cannot legally be enforced. Okay, so any change in legislation or any change in any laws that are going on there about voting cannot be enforced until the jurisdiction first obtains permission, basically, from the United States District Court for the District of Columbia, or they make a separate submission to the Attorney General. This requires proof that the voting change does not deny or get rid of the right to vote on an account of a race, colour, or membership issues in a language minority group. Okay, so basically they cannot change the voter laws, they cannot change any of the voter processes unless they have this permission, and it's got to be based on things that are not racially bound. Okay, now there's arguments to how effective this is, and there's arguments to whether it actually fits into the Constitution. And so if I go back to this, in 2013, it was challenged at the Supreme Court level in the case of Shelby County versus Holder. And when the Supreme Court came to their conclusion, which was to keep it as it is, they wrote, whilst any racial discrimination in voting is too much, Congress must ensure that the legislation it passes to remedy that problem speaks to current conditions. And so they believed that this legislation from 1965 that has been renewed over and over again still works for America and still works based on what the Constitution says. What this shows is not that people want to change the voting rights, but it shows that the voting rights and the way that it affects people is still a massive issue for civil rights protesters even now. Another issue that kind of fits with voting rights is the turnout. So voter turnout among African Americans has increased significantly over the past 40 years. In 1980, only 50% of black voters actually went to the polls, and this was compared with 61% of white voters. By 2012, this had kind of flipped. So 62% of eligible black voters cast their ballot, compared with less than 58% of white voters and just 32% of Hispanic voters. Now, this, if you remember, is for Barack Obama's second term. And so Barack Obama does have an impact on this, and he will have had an impact on the voter numbers because he will have spoken to many African Americans and got them to come out and cast their vote. But the point still stands that actually the levels of turnout for African Americans has risen steadily over this time. However, there are some developments that are disproportionately affecting black voters. 9 states have introduced a photo ID requirement for all voters in the run-up to the 2016 elections. These included 6 states that have high proportions of black voters: Alabama, Mississippi, South Carolina, Tennessee, Texas, and Virginia. Now, if you know anything about the civil rights movement and the slavery issues that have pervaded America for many, many years, you will notice that all of these states share common histories. And essentially, they've introduced these ID requirements as a gate to stop some people voting that are don't have access to photo ID, for whether it's for economic issues, they can't get the money to get one, or whether it's because they have prior convictions that means that they're not allowed to gain a photo ID requirement. To go along with that, 6 million Americans have lost their right to vote due to past convictions, and in that number, 1 in 13 African Americans are included in there, and that is 4 times higher than other American groups. Okay, now whether that's because of the disproportionately high African American arrest rates, or whether it's for other reasons, it's still something that affects the African American community more than other communities. There's also representation issues as well for African Americans. So when Jesse Jackson ran for the Democratic Party's presidential nomination in 1984, there were just 21 African American members of Congress, and all 21 of these people were in the House of Representatives. The 115th Congress, that began in 2017 and only finished relatively recently, is the most racially diverse on record. The number of African Americans had increased from 46 to 49. There was 46 in the House and 3 in the Senate. There was also a record number of Hispanic members. That was 34 in the House and 4 in the Senate. And the number of Asian members was also a record high, up from 11 to 15, with 12 in the House and 3 in the Senate. And so you can see that the racial minorities that exist in America are starting to gain more representation. Still not quite on the levels that the percentages would say that they should be, but way better than in previous years. 1972 was the first year an African American candidate contested the presidency. This was Shirley Chisholm, who ran in those years' Democratic primaries, and she won 152 delegates in the party's national convention in the end. In 1984, Jesse Jackson won over 3 million votes in the Democratic primaries and finished 3rd in the 1984 contest. But that's where it ended. It was 20 years before there was another serious African-American candidate that emerged for presidency. And then even after that, Barack Obama started way behind Hillary Clinton in 2008. Now, that's because Hillary Clinton had a name, had the brand value of being a Clinton. She was well known for being a senator as well. Barack Obama was a senator too, but a much less well-known senator. And Obama eventually, as we all know, won and became the president in 2009. In 2016, of the 22 declared major party presidential candidates, only one, Ben Carson, was black, and two others, Bobby Jindal and Marco Rubio, were from ethnic groups. I've not had a chance to look up the 2020 results on that. I can't remember if it's higher or not. That might be some activity that you could do in your spare time. So, representation in the cabinet. Once the president's elected, they get a cabinet. They appoint their cabinet based on the people that they think will advise them the best in those sections. So 6 years before that Chisholm run for presidency, President Lyndon Johnson appointed Robert Weaver as the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. So therefore, Weaver was the first African American to head a federal executive department and thereby became a member of the President's Cabinet. Since Weaver, there have been 20 other African Americans that have headed an executive department. The most racially diverse cabinet to date was the one appointed by Barack Obama in 2009. However, he only had one African American head of an executive department. And Donald Trump's cabinet was in danger of reverting to the days of Richard Nixon, when someone described the cabinet as a lot of grey-haired old men called George. A couple of typos there, I'll make sure they are fixed. There we go. So, grey-haired old men called George, yes. Even with the hiring and firing that Trump's done, it's still one of the least racially diverse cabinets that we've ever had since 1974. So, that's me done talking. I've finished waffling on about stuff. I've got some figures for the immigration numbers in America. And what I would like you to do is I would like you to make inferences based on the evidence that you're given and try and make 12 inferences, which, because there's 4 diagrams, that's 3 for each diagram. So look at each diagram. So there's a table of numbers there. Whoa. Let's change that last year. I don't know what I was doing when I made all of this stuff. That's 2013. There we go. Whoa. So look at the table. Make an inference based on the numbers. Try and make 3. Look at the graph. Make 3 inferences based on what you can see. Table, graph. Essentially, that's the task. So make sure you've noted down all the stuff that I've talked about in the previous slides, and then have a go at making some inferences based on the immigration figures for America. That's it as far as I concern year 12 for this video. So thank you very much for watching. Thank you very much for getting to the end. And overall, make sure you're staying safe. But also, if you need any help, let me know. I'm always on email. I'm always on Teams. And generally, thank you for the work that you've done so far. Keep it up. Keep going. You're doing well.